Good afternoon. My name is Nicholas Mignonelli, and I am a research librarian and the head of programming at the Lillian Goldman Law Library. The featured author of this afternoon's book talk, the final one of the semester, is Fred Shapiro, and our facilitator today is Dr. Catherine James. Fred Shapiro has been an associate director of the Yale Law Library for longer than he cares to admit. These are Fred's words, not me, not mine. And has also been a lecturer in legal research. He has published many books, including, among others, the Oxford Dictionary of American Legal Quotations, Trial and Error, an Oxford Anthology of Legal Stories, Law Talk, The Unknown Stories Behind Familiar Legal Expressions, and the Yale Book of Quotations. He is also the leading contributor to the Oxford English Dictionary and was the first person to use online searching of historical text collections for linguistic research. The subject of today's book is his latest. The subject of today's talk is his latest book, the new Yale Book of Quotations. Dr. Catherine James is the Rare Book Librarian at the Law Library, before which she worked across the street as the curator for the early modern collections at the Beinecke Library. She received a master's and a doctorate in early modern British history from Oxford and her library degree from the University of Pittsburgh, and recently published an introduction to English paleography. Thank you both for being here today. Fred, thank you so much.
Thanks for letting me do this. All right, so the first question is, how did this obsession with quotations start? Was I a 10-year-old quotation nerd? Yes, I was. This started, my father, who was not a literary type person at all. He was an engineer, but for some reason, one day he came home with a book, Bartlett's Familiar Quotations, that he got at the Strand bookstore in New York City. And I immediately liked that book. As some of you may know, my brain is very much the brain of a dilettante. I have broad knowledge, but not really deep knowledge. So, I enjoyed the kind of snippets in Bartlett's Familiar Quotations from literature and history, and I learned about literature and history from the quotations. Then when I was in college, I was an editor on an alternative student newspaper, and the most popular feature in this newspaper was on the back page they would always have quotations, and I inherited that column, edited it. So then I went to law school, and I was like the most indifferent law student of all time. I'm not proud of this, but it's the truth. Instead of going to my classes, I tended to hang out in the basement of the library, the university library. And I got interested in looking at books, old books about sports and games. And I also, up in the main reading room of the library, they had I noticed they had this huge collection of books, the Oxford English Dictionary, 20 big volumes. And I saw that it gave for each word, they tried to give the earliest use of the word they could find. So I noticed that some of these old books on sports and games had earlier uses of sports terms than sports and games terms than in the Oxford English Dictionary. So a friend of mine told me that I could write, if I wrote to the people in Oxford, they might be interested in this. So I did do that, and I got into trying to find earlier uses of words than were in the Oxford English Dictionary. And one thing that happened soon after that was in law school they had a demonstration of a new tool for lawyers called Lexis. And it had like all American cases, it seemed. So I thought, well, all right, for legal words, I could search this tool, Lexis, and see if there were earlier uses than what Oxford had. And I did do that, and I really became quite interested in doing this kind of thing. And that incidentally was the first time I think that anyone used an online database for linguistic research. So I got into that, and then I started writing letters to William Safire, who had a column in the New York Times about language every Sunday. And I became his leading source for information, historical information about words. And so someone from Oxford University Press in New York contacted me and asked me for lunch. I was living in New York at that time. And he, I guess because of the William Safire thing, he knew that I was into reference book kinds of things. And he asked me if there was any kind of reference book I wanted to write or edit. And I said, well, actually, I know I'm a law librarian, which I was at that point. I know that there's no good quotation dictionary for law, so I would like to do that. So I did a book with Oxford University Press called The Oxford Dictionary of American Legal Quotations. And while I was doing that, I got to see that the two standard quotation dictionaries, Bartlett's Familiar Quotations and the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations, were deficient in some ways, that they didn't really do as thorough research as they could. That was something that I learned from that legal quotation dictionary. And then what happened, a few years later, I had a similar kind of lunch with a Yale University Press editor in New Haven who asked if there was some kind of reference book that I wanted to do for them. And I said, well, yes, there's one I'd like to do, but it's too ambitious. You wouldn't want to do it. So he said, well, try me. I said that I wanted to do a general quotation dictionary, doing the same kind of research I had done for the legal quotation dictionary. And the head of the press at that time liked the idea, so I agreed to do a book for them. And that was the Yale Book of Quotations. It took about 6 years of work on it. People ask me, how could I possibly do this kind of thing while I had a full-time job, a family? I had research assistants for that, which was helpful. And because of what I had learned as a law librarian, I looked to databases like Lexis to help me with it. And I was lucky that while I was working on this Yale Book of Quotations, there was an explosion of these new databases, sort of like Lexis, but more powerful, going back further in time, covering more subject areas. And that really allowed me to do a kind of research that no quotation dictionary compiler had ever done before. And very powerful. By searching newspaper databases, book databases, I could find, really trace back the earliest uses I could find for all kinds of famous quotations that often changing the story, the history of who invented a particular quotation or when they used it, what the real words of the quotation were. So I just mentioned famous quotes. People ask, what kind of quotations was I interested in? So I was interested primarily in the most famous quotations. That was my main emphasis. I was not, I mean, I don't say this too much in public because it would alienate potential book buyers a lot, but I'm not, most people that are into quotations are into inspirational quotations, motivational quotations. I'm not, I don't particularly like inspirational and motivational quotations because they tend to be, cliches, platitudinous. I'm more interested in really in more sharper, incisive, even cynical quotations. But that was the primary criterion for the book, was famous quotations. I did also include quotations that weren't famous but that I really liked. I mean, that's the fun part of compiling a quotation dictionary. So that if there were quotes that I thought were particularly eloquent or funny or insightful or historically important, I would include them even if they weren't famous. So I wanted to be different from Bartlett's and Oxford in a number of ways. I wanted it to be more modern. I wanted it to be more American. Not that, I think American culture is the greatest culture in the world, but Bartlett's and Oxford were very British-oriented, and I felt there was an opening for a more American book. So like in Bartlett's or Oxford, people like John Keats or Alfred Lord Tennyson are the ones that are quoted most heavily. For me, Yogi Berra was one of the ones that I quoted the most. Mark Twain, I loved. I have a lot of his quotes. Ambrose Bierce, I don't know if you've heard of him. He did a book called The Devil's Dictionary, which I think is wonderful. So I had hundreds of quotes from Ambrose Bierce. I wanted to be more comprehensive than those books, not in the sense of being bigger, because they have more quotes than I do, but I wanted to cover things that they didn't cover that well, such as children's literature, popular culture generally, song lyrics, movie lines, sports, computers, politics, law, the social sciences. These were things that I tried to get a lot of. And I found, the most surprising thing I found with Bartlett's and Oxford was that they left out a lot of really famous quotes. In 1999, the World Almanac printed a list of the 10 most important quotes of the 20th century. And I was shocked that 3 of the 10 quotes were not in Bartlett's or Oxford. One of them was Ronald Reagan saying, I'm not a big fan of Ronald Reagan, but he did have some good quotes. He said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. That was not in Bartlett's or Oxford. I'm a big baseball fan. I don't know how many of you know Lou Gehrig said at the end of his life, he said, today I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth. That was not, that's like the most famous sports quote, was not in Oxford or Bartlett's. And the other one was the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr had a quote, the Serenity Prayer, and that's a very, very popular quote to lots of people. That was not in either of them. So that was one thing. I wanted to be more comprehensive. I wanted to do better research. That was the big thing. Oxford, it's a very scholarly work. They give great citations for their quotes. They don't do really intensive research, though. Bartlett's absolutely does not do intensive research. I'll just give one example to illustrate this, and it's a law-related quote. Justice delayed is justice denied. The Oxford Dictionary of Quotations had, for that quote, justice delayed is justice denied, they said it was a late 20th century quote. So I went to my databases, and if you search newspaper databases for that quote, you see right away that William Gladstone, a great Prime Minister of England, gave a very important speech about Ireland in 1868, in which he said justice delayed is justice denied. So I found it earlier in a Mississippi newspaper in 1838 by searching newspaper databases. People at a later stage, people from all over the world send me emails giving me quotations that I didn't include, telling me about improvements on information I had. So this one guy in Hawaii, a Yale alumnus, wrote to me saying that it was an 1815 book, Justice Delayed is Justice Denied, and not with the exact same words, but something similar, and that he said that there was a pamphlet in 1646, and the title of the pamphlet was Another Word to the Wise, showing that the delay of justice is great injustice. Not the exact same words, but pretty much the same quote. So that gives you an idea of the lack of real research in these other books. And I had research assistants. I was able to do traditional research, and sitting here is like the best place in the world to do research, because you've got the resources of the Yale University Library, the online resources. You've got 3 million books in a big building across the street. We've got a great law library with lots of books. We have a great collection of quotation dictionaries in our law library. I don't know how that could have come about. Whoever is in charge of collection development must have liked quotation dictionary. So this is a great place to do research. And then I also did crowdsourcing. And this is similar to the Oxford English Dictionary, which, back to the 1850s was doing crowdsourcing by getting people to send in information, which I benefited a lot from people before the book was published, but also after the book was published. I got, still to this day, get lots of messages from people around the world. I get, law professors here come to me with asking about quotations. That Heather Gerken wrote an article in which she asked me for help on a quotation, and she referred to the legendary Fred Shapiro in her article, which I was appreciative of. So crowdsourcing helped. And really what I was trying to do was to create an Oxford English Dictionary of Quotations. It doesn't quite have the structure of the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations. It's not obvious. And I'm not as incredibly thorough as they are with checking quotations. But the basic idea was I wanted to trace every quotation as far back as I could trace it reasonably. I didn't have time to spend hours on every quotation, but I wanted to spend at least a few minutes on checking quotations, and the research assistants helped with that. I see this as part of the general effort to preserve truth and accuracy. Nowadays, every day we know from reading the newspapers that there are people that fabricate quotations, that distort quotations, and I wanted to produce a source that journalists could look at to check citations. So the book came out in 2006, the first edition of the Yale Book of Quotations. It got a really amazing reception. Reference books are pretty out of fashion nowadays. and even back then they were getting out of fashion. But there was a tremendous response. The New Yorker had a 5-page book review of it. NPR had a story on it. For a brief moment, my book was the number 12 bestseller on Amazon. That was right after the NPR story. Then it dropped down to, now it's like 2 millionth on the list or something, the first edition. And the Wall Street Journal said it was the second most useful reference book after the World Almanac was number one. So I kept doing research after it came out, and I kept getting contributions by people around the world. I got particularly fascinated by my feeling that there were a lot of famous quotes that were originated by women, but are credited to a famous man instead. And so I was particularly interested in getting a lot of quotes by women. Just to give one example of this kind of phenomenon, the Serenity Prayer, which I mentioned, God, give me the courage to change the things I can, the serenity to accept the things I cannot, and the wisdom to know the difference. So that quote was always attributed to Reinhold Niebuhr, who was a great theologian. And there was this whole story. His family had a kind of family legend, that he originated as a sermon in a little church in the Berkshires in Massachusetts in 1943. And his daughter wrote a book, actually, all about how he originated, the entire book about this, how he originated this quotation, 1943. Well, I went to my newspaper databases, and I got 7 quotations back to 1936 of the Serenity Prayer, the same words, before Reinhold Niebuhr. No mention of Reinhold Niebuhr. So people that know me know that I'm a publicity hound. I love getting in the New York Times. So I contacted the religion reporter of the New York Times, and they actually ran a front-page story. Yale researcher questions Reinhold Niebuhr's origination of the Serenity Prayer. And then it got complicated. A few years later, someone else, actually maybe Femi and Rachel know this person, someone who works at the Duke University Library, found a 1937 instance of the Serenity Prayer, crediting it to Reinhold Niebuhr. So I thought, well, I better, try to get ahead of this story before I get embarrassed by it. So I contacted the New York Times, and they ran a second full-page story. Yale researcher eats crow, admits that he may have been wrong about the Serenity Prayer. But then later I got contacted by a professor at Rutgers University in New Jersey, and he had a theory that it was not Reinhold Niebuhr, but it was a woman named Winifred Weigel. And I already had found that the earliest trace of the Serenity Prayer that I could find was by this woman, Winifred Weigel, who was a disciple of Reinhold Niebuhr. So I still thought it was Niebuhr at that point. But he convinced me. He did incredible research and analysis. He found hundreds of examples, earlier examples of the Serenity Prayer, and it spells out a clear story that Winifred Weigel wrote it, and somehow it got attached to Reinhold Niebuhr's name, and he's a very busy man. I don't want to accuse him of fabricating it, but he, let's say, was confused about his role. and it appears clear that Winifred Weigel originated. So that's an example of obscure woman, forgotten woman, who originated a famous quote. And there's lots examples of that, and I talk about that in my book. And I also wanted to get more quotes by African Americans, by people from foreign countries. I was very English language oriented. I expanded in the first edition. I expanded my coverage of German, French quotations from around the world. So I wanted to do a second edition that could include these groups that were underrepresented in the first edition, also incorporate recent quotes, the wonderful gems by Donald Trump, which you may disagree with them, but they are famous quotes and memorable quotes. So I've got Shakespeare and Donald Trump in the same book. One of them is a lot less eloquent than the other, but he's really the biggest quote producer of recent years. I wanted to incorporate these the information that people send me in emails, some of which was brilliant. And there's a guy, a Yale PhD in computer science that was inspired by my book to get into quotations, and he created a magnificent website called quoteinvestigator.com, which is brilliant. And he researches every quote that he talks about to death, much more thorough than I have the time to do it. It's a wonderful website if you want to look at it. And other people sent me stuff that I wanted to include. And I also wanted to use the newer databases that after the first edition came out, we continued to have a great proliferation of newspaper databases and book databases, and I wanted to be able to incorporate that research in it. So that's how I came to do the second edition which is called the New Yale Book of Quotations, and I was able to include a lot of new political slogans that are just become famous in the recent years, like Black Lives Matter. That's a quotation. I traced it to its origin. So that's how I came to the second edition. And the second edition is, everything I learned from doing the first edition and everything that anyone ever told me that was wrong or left out, I've been able to incorporate. And the one thing that I think I'm proudest of for the book, other than the research, is that I somehow think was able to capture the famous quotations in a way that Bartlett's and Oxford were not. It's very rarely that anyone points out to me a very famous quotation that I just neglected to include. So I find that to be gratifying. So now I'll turn it over to Catherine to ask questions.
Thank you, Fred. And so I have just a couple of questions, and then I thought we would open things up for questions from you. So I wanted to start, and I would imagine many of our colleagues were also struck by this, with this image of young Fred neglecting his law study and finding himself browsing in the stacks of the university library, right? And I thought it was such an interesting image because it clearly shows, in some ways, the sort of dangerous pull into the collections and into a very charged form of research. And I'm really struck with the dictionary, which is such a monument of its type of research, that you have focused on the quotation as the unit, right? And it seems to me from what you've said today that you view it as a kind of unit of historical evidence or of the history of the language, but also as an instrument of correction, in some ways, that in compiling the sort of history of quotations, you're also in some ways correcting a historical record, whether it's correcting against a sort of British influence or correcting the erasure of authors or creators of intellectual content, right? And so there's a way in which the dictionary is a reference work, but it's also a sort of historical instrument, right? That you are exerting your own editorial influence on a historical record of the English language. And so I wondered if you could speak a little bit about that, and really, I guess my question, and what has been a long comment so far, leading to the question of what's your hope in the long term for like the long influence of the dictionary? Like, what do you hope it might change or contribute to the historical record of the English language?
Well, it contributes in a lot of little pieces, correcting or preserving the details of famous lines, famous passages. I also think it more broadly, created a new kind of standard of for research and for accuracy for people that use quotes, like journalists, for example. And this website I mentioned, quoteinvestigator.com, I think he's had a big impact that journalists now, I would like it if the first place they went to was my book, but probably most journalists now would first go to the quoteinvestigator.com website. So that I've had an indirect influence on that. I think that the book I did is kind of a new kind of beast in that it gives quotations that people hopefully will enjoy as quotations, but it also views a quotation as something that has a real source, and you can find out that real source by looking in my book or in other places like that website. When I see a quotation and it just says blah 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 Mark Twain, I don't consider that to be a quotation. If you see a quotation and it just gives someone's name, it's probably bogus or erroneous, particularly Mark Twain. I mean, anything that's attributed to Mark Twain is pretty much guaranteed to not be by Mark Twain. So that, to me, a quotation is something that has words, that has a meaning, has a context, but it also has an author and a specific book or article or poem or play or song or movie where it was recorded. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. And so I wanted to go back to your early research, and again, this your early pull towards this type of research in the library. And you mentioned that you were initially drawn to research on sports and games. And I wondered if you had an early discovery or some early sort of affirmation of that research that reinforced you in this, dangerous path.
Yeah, well, I actually avoided telling the real story of how it started, which is a little bit embarrassing, perhaps. So specifically, when I was in college, the college had a Tiddlywinks team, sort of a humorous thing, but it was actually a serious kind of a sport, not a very sport requiring a lot of strength or speed, but flipping little things. So I became the official historian of the North American Tiddlywinks Association. And I thought, well, as part of my duties in this august position, I should research the origins of the game of tiddlywinks. So that was what started me, because in one of these books in the Harvard Widener Library basement was a 1890 Encyclopedia of Sports and Games, and it talked about tiddlywinks. And the Oxford English Dictionary's first use for the word tiddlywinks was 1894. So that's actually how I got into it. But it's also how I got to see a lot of other interesting books on sports and games, which I later was able to find earlier examples than the OED. So it started with a specific tiddlywinks discovery. And Oxford has a tiddlywinks team, so maybe that they were receptive to that particular discovery because they knew what it meant, what tiddlywinks was, where other people might not even understand what it is.
So I wondered, on that subject, it seems as though a lot of quotation research is very explosive, that people can be attached to particular histories of how a quote originated, or to the ownership of being the first of, or having identified the first quote. And this is actually quite emotionally charged, right, or competitive in many ways. And so I wondered if you had a favorite or most compelling story of one of these moments of challenging a sort of history of a word's origins.
Yeah, well, I already mentioned the Serenity Prayer, and that was a very charged one, because Reinhold Niebuhr's daughter, the one who wrote a whole book about her father writing the Serenity Prayer, was quite unhappy about my going to the New York Times, saying that, questioning his doing it, and she threatened to complain about me to the president of Yale University, and it was that was very charged. Another example, so that's my favorite example. Another one, which was just recently, was that together with a collaborator, I discovered that the Pledge of Allegiance appeared before the person who was regarded as having written the Pledge of Allegiance wrote it. My collaborator discovered an earlier example of the Pledge of Allegiance appearing in a newspaper in Kansas. And then I worked with this other guy, and I realized that the earlier occurrence in the Kansas newspaper absolutely disproved the standard story. So the New York Times recently had a big article, a full-page article about that. But I get passionate emails from people questioning whether my theory was correct, and it actually, I think it is. There are some. I have some doubts now about my theory. I still believe that it was around before the standard story, but people have really pointed out weaknesses in the theory that about who did write it. I thought it was a 13-year-old schoolboy in Kansas that wrote it, and people are pointing out to me that idea is pretty questionable. So that's still an open question. So people do get passionate, and this is really what I enjoy the most, is in doing something that, rather than thousands of quotations that may or may not be of interest to everyone, to go for the really big ones and discover new information about them is the thing I enjoy the most.
So I think why don't we turn to questions from the group?
Thank you so much. So I guess I have a historiographical question about tracing quotes. So I imagine when you find a really early usage of a quote, like the 17th century pamphlet that predates Gladstone, there's a question at least about whether the usages are sort of part of the same historical chain, or whether it was a case of kind of independent, unrelated expressions of the same idea. And I guess I was curious, what do you see yourself as trying to do? Are you trying to sort of trace the source to which our contemporary usage goes back to, or identify the first source? And then kind of relatedly, what do you do when the two diverge? And with the kind of database linguistic research you're doing, is there an extra difficulty in figuring out if there's this continuity historically in the cases?
Yeah, I mean, the databases are kind of a two-edged sword where you can get incredible detail of how a quotation, not just how it originated, but how it developed and what the contexts were, and maybe changes in meaning or misquotes. But because they're so powerful, you could, you could spend 1,000 years really digging deep for every quote. And I don't have that kind of time. What I'll do is I have annotations, lots of little annotations after interesting quotes, or quotes where there's some controversy or ambiguities about it. And that, I think, is another one of the real contributions in my book, that there are some quotes that I do give a lot of detail for, including changes in meaning. And yeah, you're right, sometimes you could have the same quotes independently invented by two different people, or sometimes there would be similar quotes that have the same idea. And I have cross-references for that situation. You're right that there is a lot of complexity. And with these, things like the Serenity Prayer, we have hundreds of examples of its use, and you can minutely trace how it was used and what the different types of people were that use it. Are there other questions?
What makes a good quote, in your opinion? Like, what is it that, there's lots of passages you see, that short passages that seem sort of interesting, where they say something about the world, but they just don't have the staying power that others do over time.
Well, it's a complex question, and the compiler can be idiosyncratic. As I said, I'll put quotes that I like, even if they're not famous. And there's some kinds of quotes that, because of my personal views, I would never put in. Like and I get criticized for bias. Like every year, the Associated Press prints my list of the top 10 quotes of the year, and my political views definitely are visible in those lists. I try to be balanced so I don't get death threats, but if some creationist person might love a quote that says that the theory of evolution is bullshit, I would never put in a quote like that, because I believe the theory of evolution is not bullshit. So I wouldn't want to give it prominence unless it was famous. If something's famous, I will put it in, even if I totally disagree with it. And in fact, since I like pointed quotes, controversial quotes, there is a fair amount of stuff that I personally disagree with. But you could, if you really studied the book, you would learn a lot about, what I like and don't like, and how I think. Any other questions?
respect to foreign language quotes, two questions. One is, have you reached any observations about what different languages or cultures value as opposed to what's worthwhile in English for inclusion? And secondly, how do you deal with the frequent problem or issue that something sounds catchy in the original language but doesn't really translate well?
Yeah, what I do is, first of all, I give the quote in the original language if it's somewhat familiar to English speakers in the original language. So for a lot of the foreign quotes, particularly French and Latin quotes, I give the original, and then I give a translation. Yeah, I mean, that's a great, your other question is great about the particular national characteristics of quotations, but I don't know, I'd have to think a lot about that before I could answer it intelligently. But it's, I do have a fair amount of French quotations, German quotations, Italian, somewhat Spanish and Russian. I tried, like the devil, to get Chinese and Japanese quotations. I don't know. There's something about those cultures, I think, where individual quotes by individuals are not celebrated as much as in Western cultures. So I just could not get that many from China and Japan or Indian culture. The country of India was hard. Yeah, it's a challenge, and I don't pretend that I have a definitive collection of world quotations. I tried to get thousands of them, but there's still a strong English language predominance in the book. Any other questions? All right, so I guess we should adjourn. I appreciate your all coming.